Good afternoon. Can I warmly welcome you to This Is Jesus. This week is a week of events that the Christian Union put on to give every student in this town the opportunity to encounter the real Jesus. My name's Robbie. I'm one of the many Christian students in this town who've already done that. Today the question that we're looking at is unloving. Where is God when life hurts? In a minute I'm just going to pass over to our speaker, Mike Cain. We're going to aim to end all of this by 1:45, so if you've got 2 p.m. lectures, then that'll be your opportunity to head off. For those who can stay till 2, though, there'll be opportunities for questions after the talk. Mike Cain is the pastor of a church in Bristol that he describes as a church for people who don't go to church. He's also a speaker at lots of events like this at universities around the country. I'm going to hand straight over to Mike now.
Thank you, Robbie. My mother is German, which means I grew up thinking it was normal to iron socks. She married an Englishman who is obsessed with cricket, and apparently she'd been coming along to the cricket for several years, sitting, watching it from pavilion, and one particular game she was watching from pavilion during this spell of particularly hostile bowling, where the batsman was either playing and missing or being hit and ducking. And my mother famously announced to everyone sitting around her in the pavilion that she reckoned she could bowl much better than that. And everyone in the pavilion was slightly taken aback. Well, she said, he's making it so hard for the batsman to hit the ball. And it turns out, since her arrival from Germany many years earlier, she had been watching cricket all wrong. She thought the batsman and the bowler were on the same side, and that they were working together to give the fielders a hard time. See, she brought a framework of events, a framework to the events. And from her kind of occasional glance up from the book that she happened to be reading, her framework seemed to make sense of whatever it is they were doing out there. But here was a detail that didn't fit the framework. And it led to the whole construct coming tumbling down. All of us look at the world through some kind of a framework. The thinker is asking, does the framework I'm working with account for all the details, or do I need to revise my framework? And it could be that you are beginning to have a kind of sneaking suspicion that the possibility that there might be a God who made us needs to be revisited. You're thinking, yeah, the reality of God would give a framework that would make sense of our experience of being human, of not being just computers made of meat, but people who fall in love, who cry, who laugh, who write poetry, who marvel at the stars, people who are outraged by injustice, people who are prepared to lay down their lives for others. And that's just beginning to make sense to you, but then there's an earthquake in Japan. Another bomb goes off in Kabul. The test results come back from the hospital. The news is not good. Your father loses his job. And you're thinking, God was just beginning to make sense of things, but here is something that does not fit. Because if God is totally good and totally in control of this world, how could he allow there to be so much suffering? It doesn't fit. And friends, I know there's nobody here for whom this is just a kind of hypothetical question. All of us have been caught up in the crossfire of suffering. We have. And so for many, the fact of human suffering is the decisive argument against the God of the Bible. Our suffering makes us think either he is not good, doesn't even care, or maybe he's good, but he's not in control. There's nothing he can do about it. Either way, he's not worth bothering with. So the temptation is to think that the solution to the problem of suffering is to walk away from God. And can I say, if that is the road you are heading down, it seems to me that is not going to help you deal with the suffering that you are facing. It seems to me that becoming an atheist, for example, leaves you with even more problems than believing in God, a God who's good and in control. Because if there is no God, if the universe is just the product of time and chance and chemical reaction, then human suffering is not a problem as such. It's just one of the numbers that came up in the roll of the cosmic dice. There are mountains and there are valleys. There is laughter and there is pain. It's just how things are. Suffering is not a problem. It's just a fact. It just is. Everest is the tallest mountain in the world. Fact. Polar bears eat seals. Fact. My sister is dying of cancer. No. See, everything in us rises against that. Those people ravaged by that earthquake, those people blown apart by that bomb, your sister is not just a DNA propagation machine. She matters. She matters. Which is why it seems to me in the face of suffering, the atheist has a problem. And it's this, that atheism doesn't give the framework of atheism doesn't give us the tools with which to handle the sorts of feelings and the sorts of questions that are raised by suffering. See, the framework of atheism means you've just got to say, stuff happens. You've just got to stare blankly at genocide and say, stuff happens. The strong eat the weak. That's how it is. We can't do that. We can't live with that. We say, no, that is bad. And when I start saying that is bad, I'm implying a contrast with good. I'm acting as though we were living in a moral universe. I'm acting in a way that only makes sense if there is a moral God. I'm not saying that suffering proves there is a God. But plenty of people have come to believe in God through suffering. And here's why. It's because in the face of pain, our sense of right and wrong, our sense of guilt, our sense of anger, questions about justice, the sense that this matters, that we matter, that is all stuff that doesn't make sense in a universe that's just coughed up by chance. See, we think, isn't suffering a problem for the claim that there is a God? Friends, suffering is only a problem if there is a God. See, for as long as I am screaming, why, at suffering, I'm living in a way that only fits if the framework says there's a God. And what I want to do this lunchtime is just sketch that framework in a little bit more detail. I want to take us to the beginning of the story, the end of the story, and see how we get from the beginning to the end via the cross of Christ, the Christ who suffers. Let's start with the beginning. The beginning tells us that suffering is caused by human rebellion. Suffering is caused by human rebellion. Have a look at the booklets that you're probably sitting on with "This is Jesus" on the front. And inside these booklets is a little slip on which are printed some verses from the Bible. My little slip seems to be a long, long way from my eyes. It's very small, isn't it? Because the man and the woman rebel against God, God says this in Genesis chapter 3. He says, to Adam, he said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. And by the sweat of your brow you will eat your food, till you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. And the Lord God then goes to banish the man and the woman from the garden of Eden, from the place of his presence. Now, whatever you make of Genesis, the whole biblical story is founded on the fact that a world created good went wrong. In other words, there is a before and there is an after. Other ancient accounts of origins just say that evil is part of things. No, the Bible insists that evil is not how things are inherently. It is an intruder. And that means we don't just have to stare blankly at it. We don't just have to say, this is how it is. It makes sense to be outraged by it, to weep over it, to ask why. because something has gone wrong. It shouldn't be like this. Humankind was made to enjoy life with God. And what's happened is we've kind of walked out on the God of life. And that has meant death for human beings. And death is not just when you stop breathing. Death is separation from the God who made and sustains life. And we see that separation in our hearts by the fact that we don't really have a relationship with God. We don't know Him. And we see that separation in our bodies by the fact that we grow frail and we return to the dust from which we came. The whole of the human being is affected. I was talking to someone the other day who couldn't see why being separated from God should affect the whole of what it means to be human, the whole experience. But you see, God didn't just kind of make us and then sit back. He made us and He sustains us. So being cut off from God is like a plant being uprooted. A plant needs soil for life. But we need God for life. Take the plant out of the soil and the plant's whole experience is changed. It withers. And cut us off from God and our whole experience of being human is changed. We wither. We don't have the life we were made for because we walked out on the God of life. We snapped our fingers in His face and we said, we don't want you being God over us. We don't want you as our king. From now on we'll do things our way. And so we put a kind of paper crown on our own heads and we decide for ourselves what is right and what is wrong and what to love and what to hate. And because we're quite small and because we're not God and we don't know how things should be, our attempt at playing God goes horribly wrong. And we hurt the people we most love, and we hurt ourselves, and we break God's heart. Because if I'm king, and you're king, when we meet, who gets to sit on the throne? Who gets to be king? And so we fight for it. And that's why the story of humankind is a story of war. Not just with guns in battlefields, but with words. At the parties we go to, in the seminars we lead, in the teams that we are on, the power games we play to try and keep ourselves on the throne. And so life on this planet is life in the war zone. And I'm either firing the guns or I'm getting caught in the crossfire. And most of the time it's a bit of both. So life hurts because we are in rebellion against the God who made us. And our rebellion has affected the whole order of things. We've walked out on God, and what has happened is that God has stepped back from us. He said, okay, you don't think you need me? See how you get on without me. He has handed us over to the consequences of what we have done. He said, here's what happens to the world when you try and go it alone without me. The world becomes a place of toil, tears, frustration, death. And the thing is, when life is lovely, we can kind of fool ourselves. We can fool ourselves that we don't need God, we can live without God. And the fact of our mortality never really crosses our minds. We don't let it cross our minds. But in His kindness, God won't let us slumber in this delusion. Pain is a severe mercy to wake us up. It kind of brings us to our senses. It shows us we don't have power over life and death. And what we desperately need is to get back to the one who does. C.S. Lewis famously put it, God whispers in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. Pain is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world. We often laugh at the book of Genesis, don't we? But what I'm suggesting is whatever you make of its detail, it gives us a worldview that actually makes sense of how we experience this world. You could start with no God, or you could start with evil being inherently part of things, but that is not how we live. We live in a way that is consistent with what Genesis says about the world. We can't stare blankly at pain. And Genesis says, here is the foundation for our sense that all is not well. It gives us permission to cry. to call it wrong. That the suffering that we are up to our necks in is not how things were meant to be. But the beginning shows us that as members of the human race, we are not merely innocent sufferers. You see, so before we sort of take the moral high ground and put God in the dock, we're to remember that the suffering we are all caught up in different ways, to different degrees, is the fruit of our collective rebellion against God. So, the beginning. The beginning tells us suffering is caused by human rebellion. Let's go to the end. The end tells us that suffering will be brought to an end by God. Have a look at that quote there from the book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible, chapter 21, where it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Now the dwelling of God is with men. He will live with them. They will be his people. And God himself will be with them and be their God. And he will wipe every tear from their eyes. And there'll be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. For the old order of things has passed away.'" Revelation 21 gives us a picture of what the end will look like. And you'll see it says there'll be no more sea, the end of verse 1. No longer any sea. Sea is a recurring symbol for evil in the Bible. And it says there'll be no sea because people will be restored to God, will be restored to him. So there'll be no more death, no more crying, no more mourning. Which means when we look at the mess in our world, it's not that God is not in control, it's that he's not yet finished. To stop the world today, and we see injustice. We'll see some people getting away with evil. We'll see others crushed by evil. And we'll want to join in with the writer of the Psalms when he says, "Where is the God of justice?" So he goes to the end of the story and we see that God will do justice. He will do the sort of justice that the law courts can't give. He will put everything right. He will restore all things to how they were meant to be. When I was a student, my walk to the library each morning took me along a river and over a bridge. And one morning on the bank, kind of beneath the bridge, this bloke appeared with a pile of 12 huge logs. Each log was about 10 feet long and about that wide. And by the next morning, he'd stuck them in the ground, like a sort of mini forest. Bizarre. What was he doing? And then by the next day, he was scraping the bark off, and then in the weeks and the months ahead, he began carving things into the tree trunks. And from where I was sort of passing him on the towpath, it's just like a bunch of sort of random carving. There was a bunch of grapes on one, there was half a jug, a bit of tablecloth on another, half a plate, a bit of table leg there. He spent the best part of a year carving, as far as I could tell, random objects into these tree trunks. Didn't make any sense as I passed him. I like to think each morning, it wasn't each morning. I had no idea what he was up to. When he was finished, he installed a viewing seat, kind of raised wooden chair at one end of all these trunks. And if you sat in that seat, it all made sense. If you look from this one angle, all the carvings lined up to create one picture of the Last Supper. It was a wonderful thing. It was worth the wait. It was stunning. You see, stop the story now. It doesn't make any sense. Doesn't God care? But go to the end, and God's promise is that one day justice will be done. All will be put right. Our trouble, of course, is that when we think of the end of the story, we think of heaven. And when we think of heaven, let's face it, what is the image that comes up on the mental screen? Well, it's us, a few of our mates, wearing nightshirts, hanging around in a kind of cloudland. And frankly, that doesn't do it for us. It's hard to see how the prospect of that sort of cloudland existence could be any sort of consolation for those who are suffering today. Which is why you need to know that the biblical promise of salvation is not escape from this suffering world into cloudland. It is of God coming to put this suffering world right. That the language used in the Bible about the future is the language of new creation. In other words, it's this world restored to all that it was meant to be. And this world restored will not be flimsy or dull. Now is the time when things get stolen or when they rust or they rot. Now is when life is very fragile, when promising talents get snuffed out. Happy days end in divorce. Now is when we get bored. Now is when we get dissatisfied. But when God makes all things new, the new creation will be solid. Its joys will be lasting. We'll be totally satisfied. Not cloudland. And it seems to me that the promise of a world made new is very good news to people who are in pain. Because what it means is that evil and suffering do not have the last word on our lives. See, here is a promise of a future beyond evil and pain and the suffering you're going through right now. See, here is hope. And as we all know, there's nothing worse than having no hope. And many people I know feel scarred by the past. They're scarred by what people did to them or what people said to them. They're scarred by some of the mistakes they themselves have made. Suffering has so overwhelmed them that when they think of themselves, they can only think of themselves in terms of that suffering. It's become who they are. They say, well, I am that child who was abused, or I am that woman whose father died. But you see, the God of the Bible gives us hope. He says, if we entrust ourselves to him, our suffering does not have the last word on our lives. See, the God of the universe says one day, I will wipe every tear dry. I will make you whole again. You're not that child who was abused. You are that person who will one day stand healed and whole in a world made new. That's who you are. In the face of our pain, it seems to me that the prospect of a new world is something that really does make a difference today. It's the prospect of holidays that means I can keep going through the sweat of exams. So when we face suffering in our world today, we're not to think it's because God is not in control. It's that he's not finished. And you say, yeah, but this is useless. This is not helpful at all. What about now? If God is so loving, why doesn't he do away with suffering now? Isn't that our question? Well, what are you asking him to do? To do away with suffering, he'll have to do away with the people who cause the suffering. Who causes the suffering? People like me, you. See, to do away with suffering, they'll have to do away with us. So the question is, how can rebels like me, who cause the suffering, ever be part of a world where there is no suffering? How is that possible? The beginning says suffering is caused by human rebellion. The end says suffering will be brought to an end by God. The way we get from the beginning to the end is via the death of the Son of God on a cross. And the cross tells us that God has suffered for us. You see there Psalm 22 on the sheet. Psalmist says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from the words of my groaning? So those are words we can identify with, aren't they? We know what it feels to feel that God is far away from us. He doesn't seem to care about our groaning. But the knockout is that those words are words Jesus speaks as he is crucified. We saw yesterday that the Christian claims that Jesus is God made flesh. Do you see what that means? In our pain, when we are most likely to grow cynical about God, what does he know sitting up there beyond the stars? Turns out he knows. See, even in our moments of deepest pain, there is a connection between me and God. Because the God of the Bible is not remote and uncaring. He stepped into his world, this world of pain and suffering. He knows what it is to cry out in agony. He knows what it is to have a broken body and a broken heart. He knows. But it's not just that the God of the Bible suffers with us. The Bible explains that he suffered for us. Look at that last quote there from a letter that Paul writes to the Colossians. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, that's in Christ, and through him, that's through Christ, to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your mind because of your evil behaviour, but now he's reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish, free from accusation. The whole of creation is alienated from God. And you see the promise? The promise is one day it will all be restored to him. How does he restore it? By the death of Christ on the cross. By his death, the Son reconciles all things to God. See, he could have dealt with suffering by dealing with us. I mean, one way to get rid of the effects of rebellion would be to get rid of the rebels. But I'm very grateful that he didn't deal with suffering that way, in the way that I kind of wanted him to. He didn't just end it all now. I'm very grateful that in his love he found a way to deal with suffering that gives you and me a future beyond suffering. Because our rebellion meant that we faced being cut off from the God of life, meant we faced death. And the Bible explains that on the cross the Son of God died our death for us. My God, why have you forsaken me? That should have been our cry. But on the cross, for our sin, he paid. It means there's no more for us to pay. It means I don't face eternal death anymore. I'm offered eternal life. Life restored to the God who made me. So is God unloving? The bottom line is look to the cross of Christ. The cross means that the one thing we can't say in the face of suffering is it's because he doesn't love us. To see how much he loves us, suffered and died for us because he wanted to give us a future beyond suffering. Have you ever thought of that? That the Lord of the universe suffered because he wanted you to be part of a new world where there'll be no more suffering. But that's how much he loves you. So it's not just that I can look at the beginning and explain my hurt and my anger. It's not as I can look at the end and satisfy my sense of justice by the knowledge that justice will be done. I can look at the cross. And the cross means I've not just been given a theory to make sense of it all. I've been given a relationship with God. A relationship that starts today. Once you've looked at the cross, once you've seen the God whom Jesus makes known is a God who suffered for us, it doesn't make the problem of suffering easy, but it shows us that in the teeth of suffering, don't walk away from God. The cross shows us that in the teeth of suffering, he is the one person in all the world worth clinging to. Because when you walk through suffering, the God who has scars walks with you. And he promises that through whatever storm we pass, he will not let us go. He will get us through this time of suffering into a world made new. No more tears. So suffering makes us want to walk away from God, doesn't it? Seems to me suffering Suffering means we should turn to him all the more because he is our only hope. I'm going to stop there. Hand back over to Robert.
Okay, the first question is this, whenever you're ready. Are natural disasters in which thousands of innocents die a consequence fully intended by an all-knowing and loving God, and us that we are straying from him?
I think it's just worth acknowledging that these are not easy things, and we don't want to give glib answers. But interestingly, the most sensitive and loving man who ever walked this planet, Jesus Christ, speaks in those terms. So when there is a natural disaster in his day, some of his disciples are very quick in a rather unhelpful way to go, well, did it fall on them because they were particularly sinful? You know, they were rather rubbing their hands, and that was ugly. That was ugly. And Jesus said, no, that's not the kind of conclusion we draw. We're not to go, oh yeah, bad stuff happened to them because they were particularly bad. That is not the kind of connection that the Bible ever invites us to make. But Jesus does say, so you repent. And as you turn around, you turn back to God. And as he does say, it is a wake-up call to the fact that we live in a broken world and that our mortality is real, which is something we're constantly in denial over. And these things wake us up to the fact that we need to get back in touch with the God who gives us life and life that lasts forever. So that those are the terms in which Jesus speaks. I know those are hard things for us to hear, but I take it that Jesus, when he uses language like that, it's because he well, let me put it like this. The other day, I shouted at my daughter. She was in the middle, we were crossing the road, and in the middle of crossing the road, she went down to sort of fiddle with her shoelaces. And I was on carried on, and suddenly noticed that she was in the middle. That was, love meant speaking up, love meant warning her, love meant saying, get up. I could have said, well, I don't want to upset her, I want to be sort of sensitive about this, but there was a car coming. So love means speaking up. So Jesus does speak in these kinds of warning terms. I take it because he loves us. And he says, these things speak of the seriousness of the state of our world. And they speak of the seriousness of what we have done in thinking that we can live without God. So wake up. There's other ways in which he speaks.
Thanks, Mike. Can we have the next question? What about disease, like cancer? How is it humans who have caused that suffering?
These are hard things, and I think it means exploring what it means to live in a world that's created by a God who also sustains it. That's to say, if we think of God who creates the world at all, we tend to think he sort of wound the machinery up and then stepped back. And therefore we can't see how a breaking relationship with him could affect the mechanism of the sort of machinery of the world and what it is to be human. But actually the Bible talks of a God who sustains the world, sustains life. Therefore is much more, shall we say, actively involved in holding life together. Therefore his stepping back, his handing us over to living without him, is the way of understanding why things go wrong. It's not that, it's obvious, isn't it, why the human beings cause the kind of suffering that's caused by war and all those kinds of things. But the Bible, that phrase when we read from Genesis 3, the Lord says to the man and woman, cursed is the ground because of you. Again, it's very strong language, but the natural order of things is now different because of what humankind have done. Because God is handing us over to what it's like to live without his protection, without his sustaining. And disease is part of that. It's part of the language the Bible uses as the sort of consequence of our rebellion. And therefore it's part of the language the Bible uses when it talks about what Jesus has come to save us from, what Jesus has come to put right. He's come to heal our diseases. And that's not a promise that we'll all be disease-free in this world now, but that he's got his sights on disease as an enemy that he is conquering. And the promise is one day, no more disease, a world made new.
Thanks, Mike. Is there another question? Why does it take more suffering out of Jesus to take away the suffering of the world?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It takes us right to the heart of the Christian faith. Jesus' suffering was not just a sort of random suffering. It was not just a kind of heroic gesture. It's not like, I'm walking along a coastal path with my wife and I say, I love you so much, I'm going to leap off these cliffs and dash myself to pieces on the rocks below. That would be really odd. Why would suffering somehow make her feel loved? That would be very random. But if she had fallen, and in my attempt to rescue her, I was dashed to pieces on the rocks, she could say, yeah, in his love, Mike suffered for me and died for me. And that's the kind of way to understand the death of Jesus. Not just heroic gesture, but achieve something. And what it achieves is, we talked about this a couple of days ago, that God is a God of justice. And actually we long for justice. We long for all that is wrong to be dealt with. We're nervous of the idea of a God who judges. We don't like that at all. But actually we do not want justice to be done. And because there is a judge in heaven, justice will be done. And therefore evil will not just be kind of swept under the carpet. God will not just turn a blind eye to it. He'll do what we actually long for him to do. He will deal with it. It will be condemned. It will be punished. But you see, in his love, he says, evil must be punished. Sin must be punished. Because I'm a God of justice. But for your sin, I will pay. I will take the punishment. But I think that takes us right to the heart of the Christian message. A God who is so good that sin must be punished. See, that's a function of his goodness. But so good that he finds a way to punish sin, to be just, and yet to restore you and me to a relationship with him. So that's a great question. It's a question that takes you right to the heart of the good news of what Jesus has done and why he's done it. If you want to speak more on that, do you can correct it.
I think there's probably time for one last question. Oh, it looks long, doesn't it? When you say suffering makes no sense in atheism, do you mean suffering has no objective meaning, or atheism cannot account for suffering? If the former, is it right to abandon a worldview just because it leads to uncomfortable conclusions?
Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. I'm not saying that suffering makes no sense. It's our response to suffering that makes no sense. That's to say, we intuitively rise against suffering. We say it shouldn't be like that. We weep. We're outraged. We say that's unjust. It's our response to suffering that makes no sense. In a totally mechanistic world, stuff happens. Stuff happens. And there is an inconsistency in looking at something like genocide and saying, that is wrong, it shouldn't be like that. It's just what happens. When a polar bear eats a seal, people aren't outraged. But that's how it works. But when strong people beat up weak people, we are outraged. So it's more, it's not that atheism doesn't make sense of suffering. In many ways, atheism could make sense of suffering, because atheism is saying, it's a random world. It's chaos. Sure enough, it's chaos. It's our response to suffering that doesn't line up with that, because we don't just go, hey, it's chaos. We actually respond in a way that speaks of order, that speaks of right and wrong.
Thanks, Mike. Really sorry if we didn't get to answer your question this lunchtime. In fact, on Saturday, at the end of the week, we've got an hour given over to our evening speaker, Tim Keller. He'll be answering unanswered questions from throughout the week, so please make that a priority if you haven't had your question answered. Just before we close, I'd love to draw your attention to a couple of things around the room. Mike will be kind of down here. If you have any more questions, you can go and speak to him. And there's two things at the back of this room. Over there's a bookstall. Head over there if you'd like any books and things to read over this week. And in this corner, there's a question point further discussions, lots of people there to talk to as well. These have been really big issues. Perhaps you feel unsatisfied with some of the answers. I'd really encourage you to come along, particularly this evening, when we learn more about this problem in the world, and later on as well, as we start to develop some of these themes in our talks, in the lunchtimes and the evenings. The details of the talks for this evening and tomorrow lunch will be on the screen immediately behind me. I'd like to say thank you so much for coming, and I hope you have a really nice afternoon.